I'm Jack Schneider. I'm in the Education Department. Technically, I'm not here because I'm on research leave right now. So if you think you see me, you are mistaken. So thanks for joining us this afternoon for Equity, Schools, and Testing, the Challenge of the American School System. System with scare quotes.
Yeah, you like that.
The talk is co-sponsored by the Education Department and the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And this is the second in a series of talks on education that began last month and that will continue through next fall. So hopefully you can be with us for all of those, or at least those going forward. So our speaker today is Ethan Hutt, who is an assistant professor of teaching and learning, policy, and leadership at the University of Maryland, College Park. Prior to joining the faculty at Maryland, Ethan received his doctorate at Stanford University, where we actually studied together. Ethan's research focuses on the role of law in shaping the purpose and development of the American school system, and the role of metrics, like test scores, in monitoring and controlling that system. He's currently working on a book manuscript entitled The Bare Minimum, A History of Minimum Standards in American Education, which places the current standards-based accountability movement in historical perspective, framing it as the latest in a century-long effort to define the appropriate outcomes of public education. In addition to this project, Ethan has written about the legal implications of value-added models for administrators and teachers, something that if you've been paying attention to the news in the past year or two, you know that teachers are very much against. The history of grading practices, something which all of you should be familiar with, if not the history, at least the fact that grades are issued to people and that they have consequences, and on accountability in a global context. His current project, and that's what he'll be talking to us a little bit about today, continues this work on metrics by considering the role of longitudinal data sets and test scores in creating the imagined communities of American schooling. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, Ethan Hutt, and I hope you enjoy what Ethan has to share with us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out. As Jack said, I'm a assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and very excited to be here. I'll try to talk for like 40, 45 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. And if there's something that's unclear, I'm just not making sense, don't be shy, I won't bite. Feel free to just raise your hand and say, I didn't understand anything you just said. So, as Jack said, I'm presenting a bit of work that I'm working on. And yes, Jack called me out on using scare quotes around the idea of a school system. And one of the things that I want to raise in this talk is to maybe defamiliarize, to get us to think about what we mean when we talk about something called the American school system. So it's election season, and so if you've heard anything about the K-12 system, we know there's some candidates who are talking about the higher ed system, student loans, but if you've heard anything about the K-12 system, it's probably that there's a diagnosis that the education system is failing our children. And often when you see that, it's what are they referring to? Well, usually they cite something along the lines of this, some international stat, and if you can't read it, it says a 2012 study by the OECD says that the United States was ranked 27 out of 34 34 countries in mathematics. You don't have to take Ben Carson's word for it. You see it was also in the New York Times, in the US News and World Report, same line. American students fall in international academic testing, and the Chinese are leading us. And then my personal favorite, Pisa envy, which you know it's serious when it involves The Economist and a penis joke. Pisa envy is again a reference to this idea that the US is falling behind in the international rankings. And so what are all of these headlines and Ben Carson referring to? Well, they're referring to the Global Education League Table, so it's called. And there's this test that produces this table. That's what's referenced in that headline. And usually the way that you read the table like this is you note that Singapore or China is at the top. You know, maybe Finland is at 12. And here we are, the US, at 36. And so obviously the idea is that we should be concerned by this, right? Here's a table, and the US, rather than being at the top, is somewhere in the middle. But if you stop and ask yourself, what exactly is this a league table of? On what basis does it make sense to make a chart and rank school districts or school systems? And exactly what are we measuring, right? If you stop and think, how do you go about, if you were a test maker, creating a test that involves all of these different countries? And how do you account for fundamental differences in things like years of schooling, the age of the school children, and things of like curricular difference, right? What do you do with the fact that not every country does subjects in the same order, right? These seem like sort of thorny questions if you're going to say, well, here's the rank order of school districts in the world. And so the question is, how do we make sense of this narrative that we've all seen? It's in the New York Times, it's on the campaign trail that the US is, quote, falling behind, right? We're falling behind our international competition. Well, one way to do it is to think about what the actual test maker tells us they're doing. Does anyone know what Pisa, how many of you are ed majors? Any ed majors in the room? A few. A few? What? Minors. Sorry, you can't major. Just a minor. So a few. Does anyone know what Pisa measures? Are you familiar with this test? How do we get a sense of like who's on first? Anyone know? All right. Well, you're saved by the fact that I have a slide on it. So Pisa, according to the people who make it, technocrats in Europe, to put it charitably, they say it's designed to measure how well young adults at age 15 and therefore approaching the end of compulsory schooling are prepared to meet the challenges of today's knowledge societies. They continue, oops, a little bit of formatting problems. The assessment is forward-looking, focusing on young people's ability to use their knowledge and skills to meet real-life challenges rather than on the extent to which they have mastered a specific school curriculum. Oh, whoa. Pisa focuses on things that 15-year-olds will need in their future lives. The assessment is informed but not constrained by the common denominator of national school systems. Now, there are a few things, we'll see how the stretching has worked, what actually gets highlighted here, but there are a few things to note. The first is that they solve this problem of what age to do it by just saying age 15. And they say that that's the age of the end of compulsory schooling. Okay? So they're not actually measuring students at the same grade level. So if countries start earlier and later, they're not actually capturing the same number of years of schooling. They're just capturing an age. That's just a decision they make. They also say that the assessment is forward-looking. In other words, we're not so interested, say the test makers, in deciding what you already know, what you were taught in school, but what we suspect that you might need to know in the future. Now, if you can figure out what a student needs to know in 15 years, I'm sure there's a startup in Silicon Valley that would be very interested. But it's guesswork, right? It's just plain guesswork. And then the other thing that you want to note is that, and I don't know what's going to highlight here, that we focused on real-life challenges rather than on content mastered in the schools. And that's important because they're saying outright that they're not constrained by national curriculum. So if you were to read that table as saying, oh, this is a measure of how well these children in these schools learn the curriculum that's taught to them, you have incorrectly understood their table. Now, I'm not saying they're not intending to make you think that, but if you actually look what the test says it's measuring, it's not appropriate to say, well, it's a measure of how well students in America actually learn the curriculum of America. It's a different construct. So what do we end up with? Well, we end up with a test that swaps length of time for age of student, right? You're not looking at the same number of years of schooling necessarily. It actively ignores things that are intentionally taught in the curriculum, right? It says it. It rests its validity on some prediction about the future, that we're testing how students are going to do in their future lives, right? And again, they might have a guess, but it's not clear that they can actually substantiate that claim that they know. And scholars have pointed this out basically from the beginning. So what is PISA good for? Well, it's good at creating imagined communities So this idea that there's somehow a bunch of world countries that are all in competition with each other, and league tables, right? This like rank order of schools. It's also good at providing the appearance of an even playing field. Well, all the students in all these countries took the test, and this is what the score was, right? Okay, well, you can make a claim that you've created a rank order of schools, but I would argue that it's more the appearance of equity there rather than an actual thing. And if you follow anything related to news, right, all those news articles, they're good at generating competition, of saying you should be worried, countries out there, because your competitors are doing better than you, you're falling behind, right? Okay, so if you assume that the function of schooling, so you see that, you know, if you look at this league table, you often get, you'll see there are a whole bunch of books. There's a whole cottage industry that is basically selling this idea that, oh, we should be more like Finland, right? The subtitle is how the Finns educate their children. And then there's another one, Finnish Lessons 2.0. So you can see it's like revised and improved. And again, this idea is that we're selling this, you know, there are secrets out there. But it's fair to wonder that whether we're really measuring schooling or not something else. And that something else could be culture. So one thing they don't consider is is there a culture around these tests where people are actively trying to improve the scores. So I spent some time in Korea, and one of the things that's unique to Korean culture, or particularly notable about Korean culture, is they have all these cram schools. And parents spend a lot of money to send their students to cram schools to improve their scores. That's not to say the students haven't earned their place at the top, but if you thought you were comparing school systems to school systems, that complicates your interpretation. You might also be looking at curricular alignment. So some countries have made a point of making sure that their curriculum matches that of Pisa. You might be measuring socioeconomics, and economists have spent a lot of time trying to disentangle what we do with the varying socioeconomic situations. And you might also be looking at attendance policies. So one thing that a scholar at Brookings pointed out is that the Chinese systematically limit who gets access to this test at age 15. So you think that you're looking at the full population of Chinese 15-year-olds and they're scoring really well. But we know, for example, that students who are migrant and in, say, Shanghai are actively sort of prevented from taking the test. So we might be looking at something like a doctored population. Okay, so what do we do if we're a policymaker? And here you might ask yourself, well, is there really such a thing as the US education system? And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, the responsibility for schooling in the US is actually carried out by 50 states and the District of Columbia. That's near where I live, so I have to say that, even though it makes an awkward sentence. And federal law has repeatedly said that it's the states who are responsible for the education system. So there's actually no administrative body in the federal government. There is the Department of Ed, but they act in a very diminished role, at least when compared to other countries, right? So we have federal law that's repeatedly stressed, including the recent reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act, if you're familiar with that, that said it's actually the state's option. So if it's the state's responsibility, and the federal government has no real active administrative capacity in schools, what are we really looking at? Like, what do you do with these results if you're a policymaker? And here I would argue that it becomes it's difficult to figure out what you're exactly supposed to do besides be worried. And I would argue you shouldn't be worried. I mean, it might be useful, right? If you wanted to make the best charitable case for it, you might say, well, it's useful somehow in the abstract, right, that we know who we were ahead of before and now we're behind them or something like that. Or maybe you're tracking relative change over time, like our score kind of improved. But again, it becomes problematic because we said the underlying construct is sort of guesswork. And we're not really measuring how well students are learning things that we're trying to teach them. It's not, I think the best you could say is that it's not actionable information. I mean, maybe you wanted to buy those books that people are selling, Finnish lessons for your children and stuff, but it's not really active, actionable information. Okay. It's going to go off the screen. But okay, so we don't really know why a country got ahead or even if we should care. And I would argue you probably shouldn't care. Okay, so let me back up and say something in general about sort of a general argument about what system measurement means and does. And here I would want to argue, oops, I didn't actually do a slide change, there it is, that evaluation always involves simplification. It just does, period, the end. And one of the things that scholars have pointed out, the scholar James Scott, he says that one of the goals of measurement is that we want to make the complex simple, right? What is the goal of that league table if not to tell you in a really simple and condensed way, like who's on top, right? And in the process of making things legible, there's this tension, and it's a tension that I think you can usefully describe as one between complexity on the one hand and portability on the other. And you can think about this idea, if you think about the difference between essay feedback that you would receive, right? That's complicated, it's contextualized, it's rich, it's hopefully descriptive, and simply a grade or a test score. Now, the value of a grade of a test score is that you can send it to another school, the government can look at it and say, oh, 95, that's pretty good, or like 60, that's not that good. They don't really know what's behind that, right? They don't know, oh, Professor Schneider, really hard grader, so a B plus is actually really good. But all they see is the grade. So you have a tension there between complexity and portability. And certainly, are there any teachers or people who are student teachers, active, wannabe, aspiring teachers? Well, you can imagine, right, that the grades that you give to your students in the classroom, you know those students. You know how hard they're working. You know what effort or intention is behind the grades that you give them, and there's some kind of dialogue between the two of you over the course of the year. And there's a lot of context there, as opposed to the next person who sees their report card or their transcript and it's just a grade, right? What else? So numbers, and I would say a lot of times when we deal with this issue of portability, right, the ability to move that and present it to someone and have them take up that information really quickly, what we're often dealing with is numbers. And there's a quote that I quite like from a French theorist who says that numbers solve the problem of how to keep your informants by your side when they're far away. And that's what I mean is, right, when you're trying to communicate something, how is a system doing to people far away? Often there's a recourse to numbers. But when we do that, like I said before with the scores and the grades, we often are facing potentially useful local context, right? That rich part of context. And so oftentimes what we do is we create the illusion of rationality, that it's an ordered system. We did a test, everyone got a score. You create the illusion of comparability, that there's a US system and a Finnish system, and we can give them both tests, and we can compare the scores and actually know something about how the two systems are operating. And importantly, this idea of control. So one of the goals of measuring is that so someone not in your classroom can observe you, can know how your students are doing, right? There's this idea that there's some level of surveillance, some level of removed insight that's trying to be generated. And the theory goes, right, if we can manipulate those numbers, get them to go higher, that we've somehow accomplished something important. Okay, does that make sense? Maybe a little bit. Now you might be saying, okay, well you cherry-picked. You picked an international example, and the US is a particularly bad example because we don't have a centralized system of schooling. It's all fractured. And so, you know, okay, you need more convincing. And if that's true, then you might have, I would turn your attention to another set of headlines that you might have seen if you were following the education news recently. And there were headlines that sort of looked like this. Nationwide, test shows dip in students' math ability. That's the New York Times. We also have the National Review for those who don't trust the New York Times. A train wreck for reading and math scores. And the always neutral USA Today, math scores down for the first time in 25 years, right? So it's not just international comparisons that we talk about it as like a nationwide system. We also see just as robust and similar a dialogue that happens at the national level, just internally, right? And what are all of these referencing? They're referencing this chart, and as you can see, let's see if I can use my pointer, right? It was going up, and then it dropped. And this is the hysteria that you're seeing. You may also, if you're familiar, you like to follow charts or like the status of the U.S. Education system. You may have also seen it in this form, where you see a much longer trend line. So it started in 71, and now you see that we have 17-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 9-year-olds, and you can see there's like a kind of a general trend, right? And every couple of years, you will see articles just like the ones I showed you, which were from October when they released the most recent stuff. And it's, you know, hysteria about flat lines. It's hysteria about down. This test is called NAPE, the National Assessment of Education Progress. And you might ask yourself, okay, so now we're not talking about our comparisons international, US to Finland, US to Japan or something. We're talking about like 17-year-olds in the US starting in 1971 and to the present. Is there value in something like this? Because certainly if you follow the education press, this creates a ton of discussion, as I tried to show you with those headlines. So what's the value of NAPE? Well, you might say, okay, it's useful national info. It's kind of nice to know. When they first created this test in the 70s, they thought of it as a national education thermometer. That was a word they used. Or they thought of it like the GDP, that it would give us like a general guide to how our school system is doing. It can let you know, like a lot of times you'll see people say, well, kids aren't, you know, see, 1971 to present, like kids aren't dumber than they were. A lot of times they say, oh, kids these days, you know, they don't know anything. And you can point to this chart now and say, well, they're not actually dumber than they used to be. That's just you getting old. And so there's that. There's also this idea that it's low stakes, right? So, you know, no one is really responsible for like all the 17-year-olds in the country. So people make the argument that it's a low stakes test. There's a low risk of cheating. And we can, this is maybe a more technical point, but the way that we actually design this test, no one takes the full test. Everybody who's selected to take the test only takes a little portion, and so we can sample a much broader set of courses, of curriculum than we can if we just ask all students to take the full test. But we're still operating at a very, very high level of abstraction, I would argue. Like, what does it actually mean to say, that students today know as much or more than students 40 years ago? Like, is that enough more? Because, like, we've changed a lot. Society has changed a lot. So what does it mean to say, okay, we're going to put an anchor down in 1971, and we're going to measure students, like, if the knowledge or the capacities that students need are growing faster than they were in the 70s, then we might, even if we got growth, it might not be enough growth. So we create this sort of weird abstraction of like, I guess if you got in a time machine and you went back to the 1970s, you could win a math meet. Like maybe that's what we're saying. So it's not really clear how we're supposed to, maybe don't do math meets anymore. I don't know. And we still don't operate a national school system. No one here was ever a math Olympian or something. So we don't operate a national system. We still don't. You're just talking about floating 17-year-olds. We still have 50 school districts and the District of Columbia with 13,000 districts and 20,000 different teacher certification programs. So we still have a very varied and variegated system that we're dealing with even as we enter this very high level of abstraction. And you probably may have heard about, you know, some of these ideas about local control. We still have a very strong tradition of local control. And you can think about the controversies you hear about textbooks, about maybe you've heard about the controversies around the Common Core. There's a really strong sense that even if we can give all students the same test, that we're not really measuring what the underlying structure is here. And so it's not really clear, even if you wanted to say, oh, we moved up in 08, it's not really clear which of the policies, like, is that one state that's moved the number? Is it just California that's gotten better? Like, what is actually driving this? Again, because we're operating at this level, it's really hard to know what's causing things to go up or down. Okay, so you might say now, you might say, okay, well, you're still being unfair. Like, haven't we always done it like this? I mean, isn't this the way that we traditionally have done things? Like, we have a system, and it's imperfect, it's variegated, it's all of these things, but like, you know, isn't there a nod to tradition of like, we've always done it this way? And if there's two goals that I have for this talk, one is which I hope I've started to accomplish already, which is to get you to think when you see these numbers, when you see these headlines, kids' scores go down first time in 25 years, that you might want to pause in that moment and think about, what are we really talking about, right? What does it actually mean to say that? And when you see these international comparisons, to ask, what are we comparing? And does it make sense to compare it? If we are concerned, why are we concerned? And then the other thing that I want you to think about is to get some distance on this idea that this is a natural or obvious way to think about the American school system, because this is how we present NAPE data now, this national data. But actually, the very first versions of NAPE, the results were presented like this, where each item was simply presented as there was an item. So in this case, where does a human baby come from? And you can see the percentage of American 9-year-olds that said correctly the baby comes from its mother's body. But you could also see that, you know, 2% of 9-year-olds think that the hospital keeps many babies and the mother picks one out. So, you know, you could see that as okay, there's information, and it's just presented as standalone items. And we just know. And here's another one. And so it says, whenever scientists carefully measure any quantity many times, they expect that. And here you have a bunch of different ones. So you have 13-year-olds, 69% of 13-year-olds, 72% of 17-year-olds, and 57% of adults said correctly that most of the measurements will be close, but not exactly the same, right? So this was how we thought it made the most sense to present this in the 60s when this started. And the reason for that was because people understood that abstracting to the level of the nation as a whole, to turn this somehow into a number that went up or down just didn't make sense to anyone. That just didn't make sense. So every year they would publish results like this, item and then the percentage. And over time, the idea was, you know, they could say, well, 13-year-olds this year and 13-year-olds last year, and that would be how the stuff went. Now, you might, and there were some giggles, and so you might say, well, this kind of, you know, what the heck am I supposed to do with this information? It kind of reads like, and you know, I don't know if you ever saw Ripley's Believe It or Not, but it's kind of like these random facts that people just throw out, like Stuffy McInnes made only one error this season, like believe it or not, and that guy's, you know, whatever. Here's one for the academics. This guy here was testified in court at 108 to prove the validity of a survey that he had done 85 years before. Like, they're just kind of like random facts that people are throwing out. Like, you could say, you know, did you know that 2% of 9-year-olds think that mothers just go to the hospital and like a Cabbage Patch, they just like pick a baby? And truthfully, when Time magazine covered the first release, they ran this story. So there was this item, among 5 animals that have been found as fossils in rocks, only dinosaurs have never been seen alive by man. So 89% of Americans got that right. And so this was their snarky remark. 89% of 17-year-olds knew that living dinosaurs have never been seen by men. The Flintstones, oh, it's supposed to say the Flintstones notwithstanding. And so it was sort of a joke. It was like these facts that you could just throw out. And the result of that was that increasingly people said, we don't want just sort of random facts. We want to be able to compare things, right? We want to have some knowledge that we can, you know, tell us, is it better, is it worse? There's sort of this impulse to understand, this impulse to track. And so, sure enough, what we got was very late on, in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act said that no more would we just publish the single national result. We wanted to disaggregate that result by state. So the federal government said, if you're going to accept federal money, you have to submit the state students to this exam so that we can disaggregate. And so what we got was graphs that now look like this, where you could see, oh, sure enough, like everyone already suspected, the not all 50 states were exactly on that national line, right? Some states, congratulations, Massachusetts, were much higher, and some states were much lower. And so maybe you're saying, okay, well, this is what progress looks like in science. You know, we start with like a quasi-good idea and we improve it over time. And so, you know, is the disaggregated stuff better? That's where we are currently right now. And I would say maybe. I mean, at least we're now dealing in units that, you know, actually have responsibility for running a school system. But it's still not clear whether the differences in those lines reflect differences in actual programs. And if so, which one? Like, why is Massachusetts rise faster? There are so many things that are happening at any time, both inside a school and outside the school, that when you aggregate to the state level and you try to compare across states, it's not clear what's going on, right? And people love to throw out theories. Oh, it's charter schools. Oh, it's Teach for America. Oh, it's, you know, we busted the unions. And you could never validate, or it's very, very, very difficult to validate any of those claims. And most scholars say it's sort of a fool's errand. So, I mean, it could be, like I said, teacher quality. We could be dealing with the effects of curriculum, right? So Massachusetts likes to say, like, we have the best standards and the best curriculum. That's why our scores are high. Well, it could be. It could be that you also spend more. It could be that you have a highly educated adult population. I mean, there are tons of things, and it's very hard to know what's going on under these trend lines. This is 8th grade. So one theory is that you have a very good middle school system, or Mississippi has a very bad middle school system. But it's equally plausible that actually it's because Mississippi actually has the best elementary school system in the country, but the worst middle school system. Like, you don't actually know what precedes this trend line, right? It's possible that Massachusetts would be even higher if the middle school reading teachers would just do their jobs, right? We don't actually know, and it's impossible to disentangle. Those were all hypotheticals. I wasn't casting aspersions on anyone. Okay, so, you know, so we like to say that, you know, this here is obviously superior to this or the other format. And, you know, we've gone ahead and did exactly what we did with the Pisa, which is now every year when we publish, you get the rank order. It's the exact same table. Someone here has tried to control for what the demographics of a state do. And you can see Massachusetts doesn't look quite as good if you try to control for the underlying demographics. But we've basically ended up where we were with the international comparisons. A rank order that doesn't really tell us what's going on in the underlying school systems in these states. You know, you've basically done the same thing. Even though we've gotten rid of the international comparison, we've still ended up with this same notion that it's competition, we should be concerned about the rank order, and we've effaced any sense that we can actually get at the underlying issue. So I want to take the little bit of time that I have left and really try to argue and impress the point upon you that we haven't always done it this way. That this way of doing things is the byproduct of a specific historical moment, and that there's nothing obvious or inevitable about insisting that we rank order by country or rank order by state, and that it's useful. I mean, you might still say, I still think it's useful to have that information. That's fine, but I do think that it's important that we think about why we do the things that we do and where that tradition came from, okay? And so this is the project that I'm working on now because I'm a historian by training. And so I would argue that what we've done over the last, say, half century, last 60 years, is we've shifted from recognizing differences in schools and students and wanting equality from people who are similarly associated. So we were concerned in the 1950s by the idea that two schools would have students with the same demographics and produce different results. And we've gone from that to inverting it and saying what we actually want, is demanding equality from schools and children regardless of their differences. And I would say that the No Child Left Behind Act, where we say regardless of the underlying composition of your school, there's a standard and you should hit it, and it's going to take you time, but basically we want the same expectations for all schools and all children. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is an inversion of how we used to think about things. And I think it's worth seeing where that came from. So I'm going to run through some examples, try to show you where this development comes from, and to argue that the universal scale that we want to create, right, this idea that regardless of the school demographics, they should all be achieving the same. No child left behind, right? It's not like all the children excellent, but some are still ahead. It's like, no, all children together, no one left behind, don't lose your neighbor. And that the universal scale requires that we create or imagine universal units, right? We have to start imagining that, oh, all school systems are comparable at some level, and international countries are comparable at some other level. And we do that for the sake of our comparisons, right? To substantiate that position there. Okay, so, and then the last point, that quantification, I would again argue, is a key mechanism. It's the thing that allows us to feel confident that we've preserved enough, right? Enough of the underlying context. The A will speak for itself, as I had a professor once say. So on this question of like, haven't we always done it this way? And the truth is, if you go back to the very beginning of education statistics in this country, which means I assume you go to the library and you find the section where they keep all the old federal documents, and you open one of those giant volumes that no idea how they ever bound them, and you looked at the old Bureau of Education reports, you would come across statistical tables that look like this. So here I found one, and this is what they look like. It says just institution. It's all the colleges and institutions in the country. This is a very long table, and I found one that had the College of Holy Cross in it. This is from 1881. And what you can see is it's just a list of the college and then the degrees, the number of degrees of different kinds that they issued in that year. That was the state of education statistics. And you'll note a couple important things here is that it's just a list. There's no like, well, any school that offered less than 50 degrees is like below average, right? It's sort of presented without commentary. There's no normative assessment. It was just compiling. And the idea that it was like an index, an atlas, where it was just the facts. And so, yeah, you've created a category by saying, okay, all these schools are similar, and if there are sociologists in the room, I'm happy to. We are creating categories here, but the idea is that this is a very low level, right? It's just school and number. And so, the idea that the federal government was always in the business of evaluation is just not true. I have no idea whether 21 degrees for Holy Cross in 1881 was a good thing or a bad thing, and neither did the federal government, as it turned out. So if we fast forward to the 1950s, there's a very interesting study that was funded by the federal government called the New York Quality Measurement Project. And this, if you know something about US history, 1950s, this is like the midst of the Cold War, sort of. And we're starting to get serious as a country about improving our school quality. And what you see when you look at, this is the report. So this was funded by the federal government, and the idea of this project was that they were going to find the qualities of school systems that made them excellent, and then figure out how to make sure that all school districts that look like that, or all schools that look like that, were similarly excellent. And this is what they said. The goal of the American public education system is to capitalize maximally on the potential of all types of pupils. Notice that they are identifying that not all the children are the same. There are different kinds of pupils, and we're going to maximize each one. And a necessary requisite toward the goal is the development of procedures for identifying unevenness within systems in effectiveness with different types of pupils. So the idea was there are different types of pupils and different types of systems, and we're going to make sure that each one is maximized, right? The special feature of our project, this is them talking, is its approach to quality assessment is that it directs attention to variation among systems that seem to have similar institutional potential, right? Again, noting that there are just differences and then there need to be subcategories, but we're not trying to make all the schools the same. We don't have the same expectations for everybody. In terms of controlling factors in the local setting that schools themselves cannot readily influence, like the type of community or socioeconomics. And the key thing, and this is my favorite quote from the report, they say, and this is their conclusion, a rural district cannot be transmuted into an urban district. Yet urbanness and ruralness probably have differential effects on the nature of the school system. And this was their argument that we shouldn't treat schools the same. We should recognize their differences and then try to maximize whatever potential that they had. And so you see here, there's an explicit recognition of difference, and we're maximizing the efficiency within it. If we go a little bit further, and now we're beginning to see it shift, we're even further into the Cold War, there was this thing called Project Talent, which is the largest ever longitudinal study brought to you by these fine folks over here. I always like, Mad Men right here. And this was a study of 440,000 students in 1,300 high schools. All those little dots that you see on the on the map there are not just like bad resolution. Those are all the high schools that participated in this thing. And the idea of the Project Talent was that we needed to identify the differences, the abilities of American students, and figure out not how to change them and make them the same, but to maximally develop them. We just had to learn. We had to get into who they are, where they're going, and follow them through school. This was going to be a longitudinal study. And they're actually, random aside, there are still reunions of people who took this study to this day. They're now all like in their 80s and 90s, and they get together and they talk about their results. It's weird. I didn't say that. It's not weird. It's totally cool. And one of the things that was interesting about this study was the explicit recognition by the creators that the system was not ready to be unified in this way. So what they had to, I don't know if you can see it, it says that these are all the tests that they gave the students. This is a brochure that they are sending out to schools. And each of the tests in the battery for Project Talent was specifically designed because they recognized that there was nothing similar about these schools, right? And the goal for them was to produce a chart that looked like this. And this was going to be what the student would see. And you could see based on each of these tests, you'd have a profile, and the school would recognize your profile, and we could direct you to the school that was best optimized for your ability. Yeah, I already told you that part. And one of the things that they were hoping to give to schools was this pattern of, this is what the profile of an engineer is, or this is what a male teacher is going to look like. That's going to be their score profile, and the female teacher, the female score. And so the idea was that there was inherent difference, and that we weren't trying to make everything the same, but we were trying to best guide in the system. Okay, another quick example. Now, just so you understand that this is changing at this time, this was a book written at the exact same time that Project Talent is happening by James Conant, who is the president of Harvard and worked on the Manhattan Project. And so you can get a sense of this shift where we're beginning to see people who are saying, okay, the system is not the same, but we can impose a rationality on it. Conant, who is, I said, the president of Harvard, he wrote this book where he basically took a 2-year-long road trip and went to as many high schools in the US as he could. And he writes this in the conclusion that he doubts whether it's possible to obtain information which one could generalize the success or failure of the American school in regard to the education of any group of children. He thought it had to be impressionistic. We had to preserve the local context. I don't have to tell you, based on the beginning of my talk, that he was increasingly in a minority, right? There was increasingly this idea that we could construct a universal standard for all students. This is Commissioner Keppel, who is another a Harvard guy. He was actually the dean of the Harvard Ed School. And he was probably more than anyone responsible for this transformation. He had this vision of America. And again, it's a Cold War project. And he's concerned with manpower development, right? His desire is to make things, as I said before, legible so that from Washington, they could control the production of human capital. Notice that this is probably not how educators are thinking about schooling. If you can't read the little thing here, It's him saying education is too important to be left solely to the educators. It was like, duh. That was his throwdown to the American education system. And he was the one who really accelerated it and made it a federal project to create a national system. He brought us NAPE, which I talked to you about before. He also brings us the National Center for Education Statistics and the very first longitudinal study. Well, not the first one. Project Talent's the first one, but the first one that NCES runs. And he recognized very clearly that this required an effacing of local variation in order to produce national results. But he was a manpower planner. That's what he did in the war. That's what he was concerned with. And so you can see how the interests of educators and the interests of those who control Washington could diverge, and they did certainly in this period. Okay, the last thing. Maybe you've heard of a nation at risk. And if you've heard about a nation at risk, you've probably maybe read some of their findings. You know, the nation at risk was the thing that launched the modern standards movement. And they say things like, secondary school curricula have been homogenized, diluted, diffused to the point that they no longer have a central purpose. The proportion of students taking a general program of study has increased from 12% to 42%. General study meant you weren't studying like the hard sciences or the hard math. We offer intermediate algebra, but only 31% of our recent high school graduates complete it, right? So here you see in '83 people talking very comfortably about a national system. But if you actually stop and think about where those numbers come from, like how did they generate, how did they know that only 31% of students took high school algebra? Well, they had to do a lot of really hard work. The Center for, basically the Department of Education created this document in 1982 called the Classification of Secondary School Courses. And it took the people at the Department of Ed 2 years to develop a classification in order to classify this national sample of transcripts in order to produce those statistics. So those involved 131 different course categories, 13 general headings, 3 curricular tracks. And if you, just to give you a sense, if you looked at just these 3 states, California, Illinois, and Washington, combined, they had between 500 and 700 different unique course titles each. So the point here is that in order to speak collectively about a national school system, it takes an incredible amount of work. They had to spend 2 years to code these transcripts to make them generalizable enough to say something like 31% of kids took intermediate algebra. But like, that's not a course that kids took. They took a whole bunch of different courses, and people in Washington figured out how to say, okay, these are sort of the same course. They didn't actually look at the curriculum, they looked at the transcripts and created this idea that like, oh, there was something out there called intermediate algebra and 31% of kids took it. The work requires an imposition of a standard on a non-standard reality, right? And this is this is one thing if it's like, we tried, we're just like kicking around some statistics, but this was the basis, this is the document that was the basis for the modern standards movement, right? So it seems like the amount of work that went into it, it's a pretty, I would think, perilous reform document. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm not saying, I don't want you to leave this talk and thinking that I'm saying that assessment is unimportant, that it's useless, that it's never relevant, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we need to be aware and cognizant of the fact that assessment involves simplification and abstraction. It always does, right? This means that we create imaginary entities like the American school. It also means that we create imaginary communities, right? We create this idea that US and Finland are somehow like pitched in school battle. And Qatar is too, and so is China, and maybe Massachusetts and Mississippi are as well. We also need to understand that this abstraction is a precondition of legibility. It is not a technical error. It is not simply enough to say, well, science improves always. It just does. It gets better. You're still going to have this issue of abstraction. And we need to always ask ourselves when we look at these abstractions, we're making something legible to whom? And for what purpose? Why do we want to be able to rank these countries? And does it even make sense to do so? Maybe we don't care that, like, old people can open their paper and compare like Finland and the US in their minds, right? Maybe that's not worth it. And the other thing I want to say is that we've embraced this centralized vision, this Cold War manpower vision, right? Where the federal government needs to figure out how many engineers are we going to produce this year. And what we've done in embracing that vision is we've put it on top of a system that doesn't have the requisite uniformity or the strength of infrastructure to really support that vision. So we've imagined that we were Finland and we have a nationalized school system and we can control everything from the capital. But in reality, what we're doing is we are actively creating this illusion that we have that so that we can produce these numbers. And I think that that's a dangerous way to think about policy. I think it's a dangerous way to think about how our schools are doing, and so that we need to be aware. We may conclude that that's the best that we've got, and that's the best we can do because we don't trust local districts to do it themselves. And I think you could certainly make that argument, right? The abstraction is a necessary evil, but at the very least, I think we have to recognize that it is an abstraction, and we have to think about the effort that goes behind it and what those trade-offs are. And with that, I will thank you and take any questions you guys have. Any questions? Yes?
Well, I have a comment.
Okay.
I know you're not keen on Pisa or 10 to NAPE.
Sure.
But I'm a developmental psychologist,
Yeah.
Cognitive development person. And I think one of the good things that has come from all this Pisa data is that it's really propelled the research on how children learn mathematics. And to the degree that that research can benefit students in the U.S., I think that's been a good outcome.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people are collaborating with scholars in Finland and Singapore, Korea. So what are the mental processes and cognitive processes that go into teaching your math courses this way versus that way? I think if you opened up any journal in my field right now, you would find that half the articles each month are on children's mathematical thinking. And that's a really good outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally open to positive unintended consequences of it, and certainly competition can be valuable. And so I would say that I would be willing to wager that a lot of the research you're talking about is funded by the federal government and possibly even the Defense Department, and is interested in the psychological processes that are seen as universal and all those things. And I think that's great. And I would agree that certainly if there's going to be a positive outcome, I would like it to be, knowledge and research as opposed to just hand-wringing. So I have no problem saying that I'm really happy, actually, and I will use that as an example of a really positive outcome. I just think that when people talk about it, I mean, it may be useful for, I guess, writing grants and securing money and interest into certain areas, and certainly math and science has been the chief beneficiaries of this. This sort of Cold War hysteria about technology. And yeah, I mean, I think that is a great outcome. I'm not going to say it's not. I just think that there are certainly ways that we could support the production of knowledge that don't involve, pretending like Qatar and the U.S. education system are somehow in like direct competition.
My second comment, or maybe it's more of a question, is on your point of universal standards and universal questions. I actually haven't looked at the Pisa questions in a long time, but I think I can imagine that there are some mathematical skills that all children should learn. I'm just going to tell you a little story. I went to an event at another university last week. It was an author who was selling a book. I bought the book. It was $14.50.
Was it good?
And yeah, it's Naomi Klein.
Oh, okay.
So, I gave the young lady $20.50, and she couldn't give me the right change. So I think, in terms of a university student who can't do that kind of operation, there's a problem. So it seems to me that there are certain mathematical skills people need to function in life.
But I'm all for that if we want to have that as an argument, but that's not what Pisa says it's doing. I mean, they're not saying, they're saying we have imagined a future in which, there's technology and there's science and you need to use what you know and apply it. But They can't substantiate the underlying construct validity of that.
I'm not saying I really love Pisa, but I'm just wondering who's going to take up. You're saying that the project itself is not impossible.
Right.
But who's going to take up the project that's possible?
You're saying that Pisa is the only way we can accomplish it?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that if there are some universal skills that we agree all children should master in mathematics, for example, isn't there somebody out there who wants to develop that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so concerned about the idea that there aren't. I mean, historically, there's always been like the most popular textbook in the country. You know, I guess what I'm saying is I'm more comfortable letting individual districts and individual states decide for themselves what those things are, rather than create a fictive world in which people who are not really in competition are placed in competition, and then ostensibly to keep up in this competition, we then say, you have to have standards, and by the way, there are tests that come with these standards, and oh, by the way, here's our textbook that we wrote to these standards. Would you like to buy that? I mean, I think there's a different way to let people come together collaboratively to decide what it is that we want our children to know. And if that happens to be universal, I think that's great. But the way that we've gone, at least since the 60s, is to do it the other way. To have someone say, this is the universal way of doing things, and now we're going to shame you publicly via table, and that's how we're going to accomplish that. So I mean, I think we can all agree that there are certain things that we want students to know. And I think maybe if you're an optimist, you know, Common Core maybe represents a step towards that. But we'll have to see about how it's implemented. And certainly there's plenty of room within those like very broad standards for, you know, variation to occur. And we'll see if people are interested in allowing that variation, or there really is going to be a strict universal process. But I tend to have faith in individual communities, or certainly districts and states, to figure it out as they see fit. I mean, if it's a resource question, I'm totally for the federal government making up resource deficiencies, but I'm not sure why they should say so. Any other questions? Jack has a question? You'll ask a question.
You talked about two different levels of comparing nations against each other. I'll say nations instead of states, so you don't get confused. Okay. So comparing, for instance, the U.S. and Finland, and within a nation, and the United States, comparing states with each other, in your example with Massachusetts and Mississippi. And I want you to go one level down to within a state, comparing districts with each other, where, for instance, we go to Boston Globe the day after MCAS scores have been released and see that if you live in Weston, the schools are good, quote unquote, scare quotes around that, and if you live in Worcester, the schools are bad, again, scare quotes around that. And I am just interested in hearing you talk a little bit about the degree of which it is the same kind of phenomenon, country to country, state to state, district to district, and how that.
I mean, I think obviously the lower the level of abstraction, I think the more comfortable you can get. You know, I mean, I think it depends in part what are we doing it for? I mean, in states like Massachusetts, at least my understanding of Massachusetts, you know, the more centralized the system, so that we can verify that all students are using the same textbook and that the same standards have been applied to the teachers and there actually is equalization in funding. I think the closer that you get into sort of standardizing all of those dimensions, I think the more comfortable you can feel that you're actually looking at something real. Usually the way we do it, though, maybe not in the Boston Globe, is, you know, economists take the information and they say, well, we know that students from low-income families are different, so we're just going to statistically control for all of these things at the school level, maybe at the family level, at the teacher classroom level, and the more statistical gymnastics that go into a comparison to say, oh, this is now a true comparison, the less comfortable I get. I mean, I think that certainly a state with a strong sort of centralized core, I think, you know, there is certainly a lot more value within a state to compare its school districts and try to decide. But again, I get uncomfortable when the purpose is to publish the results for the sake of shaming, because the reality is, as much as we would like to believe that our statistical controls are robust, I just don't have that much faith that when you get down to it that, I mean, at the very core, you're treating it, I mean, this is true in a lot of the value-added stuff, you're treating them as independent units. Then you're assuming that a teacher in this school, in this environment, if you pluck them out and put them somewhere else, that somehow it's just the core of them and not something about context. And those kinds of comparisons make me pretty uncomfortable.
Can I ask a really quick follow-up
Yeah.
question? And I want to ask you to put on the chair of psychologist for a minute and tell me why we love these things. Why we clearly love these lists, otherwise they wouldn't exist.
Right.
The market, as you showed, there is a market for it. U.S. News and World Report, the National Review, the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, which does nothing at this
Right.
time. It's not a news organization.
Yeah.
All it does is make lists.
Yeah.
Why do we want to see these rankings so bad?
I think that the more uncertain the outcome is, or sort of the less obvious the direct comparison presents itself, the more that we rely and we seek comfort in lists. Like, you know, you think about things like, you never see a list of like the, you know, top 25 like fastest people in the world, right? Because that's just an obvious thing. Like, you don't have to generate that list. But we do see things like, you know, pound for pound best fighter, you know? And what we're trying to do there is we're saying, well, these two guys are never actually going to compete directly. So let's create a list and we'll like generate discussion about it. And so I think in education, where the competition is so nebulous and the outcome is so uncertain, like my kids can read, my kids can do math, like, are they reading well enough? Are they reading, you know, there's sort of this anxiety. And I think that by producing these lists, it's a way of I think it's a particularly American way of saying, oh, we're doing a good job. Or like, guys, you're not striving hard enough. You know, it's simply that you haven't pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. And so I think, you know, if education had sort of more final and more obvious sort of endpoints where we could directly compare, I think you would see less lists. But because it's so nebulous, and everyone always says like, well, tests don't measure everything and all this, that we then want to have some way of saying, well, like, how are we doing, you know? And I understand that, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. Teachers all the time give tests so that they can know how their students are doing. But that information stays, one, privately within the classroom, or maybe it's shared with students and parents. It's not published. It's not an act of shaming. And that's where I think we get into a different dimension. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe so. Yeah.
Do we have anything we can learn from Singapore or Finland?
I mean, socialized medicine? No. I mean, I don't. No, I mean, yeah.
Mathematics.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. The idea. I guess the answer is yes. I think we have a lot to learn, right? So for one thing, we know that Finland spends an incredibly large amount of time and resources educating their teachers. That is something that they invest in heavily. We do not do anything approximating that. We don't make a commitment to that, to our teachers in terms of like financial stability, in terms of treating them as professionals who develop over time. And so do I think that's a great idea? Sure. Do I think we could implement it in our current political climate? No. So I mean, I think there are lots of things. Do I think Singapore math is a potentially very good way of teaching mathematics? Absolutely. Is it the only way to teach mathematics? No. Are our teachers prepared to teach Singapore math? Probably not. If we wanted to invest in them, could we teach them to teach Singapore mathematics? Yeah. I mean, I think the issue is like there's lots of good things that people are doing, and I think the idea that we can learn and look to other places and say, hey, they have something that's right here. Though it's hard to know from the Pisa scores what those things are, but I think the problem is in transporting those ideas. We don't have, I mean, we would love to have a professionalized teacher corps like they do in Japan or like in Finland, but we just don't. So I'm not sure, you know, if you just said, oh, well, we'll give them some professional development, which is what we often do. Like the literature on professional development says like professional development doesn't work. And you can think of lots of reasons why, but you know, I mean, I think it's a good way of generating ideas and seeing what other people are doing. I just don't think they're transportable insights.
Without using these flawed rankings, what should or could replace them in terms of being able to detect places to look where good things are happening?
I mean, you know, I think there's no reason that we can't, you know, every system has its, you know, has its English language learners and its immigrant populations and, you know, its low socioeconomic students, and we all have different strategies of addressing them. You do not have, I mean, and I mean, the scholars publish insights and say, we found something in our lab, we found this way, and it seems like these students are persisting longer, they're going to college, they're doing all these things. And, you know, we can have a scholarly debate about, wow, is there something there? Like, how does it work? What's the mechanism? That just doesn't have to result in a U.S. News World Report, because I actually think that when you find those insights, those are probably not the things that are driving these numbers, right? They are things that schools or states or researchers are trying out and are trying to spread and share. And I guess if what we're saying is that the Pisa is the only way to get people to pay attention, then maybe that's a real indictment of the academy, or an indictment of governments who are just not interested unless there are stakes involved. And so maybe going back to your point that that's the only way, I'm skeptical that that's true, because I'm skeptical that when you put it in this frame, that what you're really after is deep insight, and you're more interested in moving up the rankings. And there are a lot of other ways that don't involve deep learning or creating basic science that could bump up your rankings. China's done it. They just simply let their 15-year-olds who are non-socioeconomically at the top, they don't have them take the test. That's another way. I mean, we're assuming the only way that you can go up the rankings is by doing something like above board, but there's no reason for that. And so I think often politicians are more interested in, I mean, we could have lots of ways that we improve test scores. What have we seen? People cram for them. You know, schools whose livelihood is staked on positive test scores, well, they tell the teachers, like, teach the test. So, I mean, you know, I don't know, maybe that's not helpful. That's why you shouldn't ask historians policy questions.
I think we're probably out of time here, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming out and staying.